Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our information and support session. My name is Kathleen Helgeson and I'm the coordinator of the Patient and Family Resource Center. For many people, clinical trials hold the promise of breakthroughs in cancer research and treatment. Today we are joined by Kathryn Dyck and Dr. Joel Gingerich, who will be explaining the role of clinical trials at Cancer Care. We're very pleased to offer this session with the generous funding support of the Cancer Care Manitoba Foundation. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting from all regions in Manitoba, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, and Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. It's important for us to foster inclusivity and reconciliation and encourage others to do the same. Before we continue, there are some basic Zoom features I'd like to explain. You'll notice as an attendee, your microphone and your video are turned off. If you have a question for our guests at any time during the presentation, just click on the Q&A icon on your screen and type your question. You can also choose to ask that question anonymously by checking the Send Anonymously box before you click on the blue arrow to send. My coworker, Allie, is also here off screen and will be helping manage your questions as they come in. If you have a technical concern, you can also type that in the Q&A and Allie will answer your question privately and try to assist you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest. Kathryn has been involved with clinical trials in oncology at Cancer Care for the past 26 years. Her previous experience in data management, ethics and regulatory affairs, and supervisory positions provided a strong foundation for her role as clinical trials unit manager, a position she held for 17 years. Under Kathryn's leadership, the department's operations expanded and evolved, allowing more Manitobans the opportunity to participate in clinical trials. Dr. Joel Gingerich is an assistant professor and medical oncologist in the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Manitoba, an interim co-head for the Department of Medical Oncology and Hematology at Cancer Care Manitoba, and the medical director of the Clinical Trials Unit for Cancer Care Manitoba. His clinical practices focuses on patients with genitourinary cancers and the management of patients with complex cancer-related symptoms. In addition to his administrative responsibilities, he's actively involved in medical education, clinical research, and has been the author on multiple peer-reviewed journal articles. Welcome to you both, and thank you so much for helping us maybe uncloak some of the mystery surrounding clinical trials today. And Dr. Gingerich, I think you might also be muted there. I think you're going to begin with your slides.
Thank you. I'm just going to get my slides up and running here.
Great.
Okay, can everyone see the slides? Perfect. Well, I just want to start by saying thank you for letting me participate in today's webinar. It's a real privilege. From a professional standpoint, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the patients and families that are navigating the complexities of cancer. And from a personal level, I have some insight into what that means and how challenging it is to go through the journey. So this hits home for me. So what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about why clinical trials are important, and then talk about the different types of clinical trials, and then end by talking about some of the regulatory process on how clinical trials make their way into standard treatment options. And then I'll pass it on to Kathryn, who will give some more insight into clinical trials. So to start with, clinical trials are important because not everything that we think is a good idea ends up being a good idea. And I have some examples here on this slide. So in the left upper hand quarter of the slide, you can see an advertisement for cigarettes. And this advertisement is using physicians to say that there's a certain type of cigarette that is going to be less irritating and better for you than others. We now know, of course, that smoking cigarettes is not good for us from a variety of different standpoints. And so the idea of having physicians endorse a certain type of cigarettes, probably not a great idea in retrospect. Another example is using cocaine tooth drops. This is for individuals, including children, that were having teeth pain or tooth pain. And we now know, of course, using cocaine to help with toothaches, probably not a very good idea. Another example is for losing weight and using sanitized tapeworms. Again, probably in retrospect, not such a great idea. And another example is using Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. And this soothing syrup had opioids in it, similar to morphine, to help children fall asleep. And we know also in retrospect that that's not a good idea. And lastly, snake oil ointment. Snake oil ointment initially had snake oil components in it, and it was advertised as a panacea that would help a lot of different types of ailments. And over time, they found that snake oil ointment actually didn't have any snake oil in it at all and wasn't effective. And so this just, I think, highlights the importance of having good data to help us prove if something is beneficial or not. And especially in the field of cancer, it's extremely important that we have strong studies and data and clinical trials that can help point us to improve outcomes for patients. And so that leads us to clinical research. Clinical research in the cancer sphere is really the best way for us to objectively improve treatment options and outcomes for patients with cancer. Now, this is a slide that looks at the improvement in absolute percentage of annual 5-year cancer-specific survival rates since the 1970s. And I realize that that's a bit of a handful in terms, or a mouthful in terms of what that means. But essentially what it's looking at is it's looking at how many patients with their cancer were alive and doing well 5 years after they were diagnosed with their cancer. And you can see since the 1970s, there's been a significant improvement in the amount of patients who are alive and doing well. And that improvement was incremental over time. And although this slide ends at 2010, you can come up with slides that talk or show a similar thing after 2010. And the question is what's been the major driver of making patients end up doing better over this time frame? And it's highlighted in this slide, and it's a bit of a complicated slide, and I'll just walk you through it a little bit. But the box that you can see looks at the absolute percentage improvement in cancer 5-year survival versus the average amount of patients who were put on a clinical trial. And you can see that there's this relationship between the two, where the more patients that were put on a clinical trial, the better the absolute percentage improvement in this 5-year survival rate. And if you break that down by age, you can see that if you look at the amount of patients per age group that were put on a clinical trial, it roughly correlates with the amount of improvement in this absolute percentage change in 5-year overall survival. And it just highlights the importance of clinical trials and really driving the improvements that we've seen over time in patients with cancer. So why do we conduct clinical trials? The reason for that is clinical trials really help us understand how a treatment works, how safe it is, and if it causes any specific side effects. And findings from clinical trials really help us improve cancer care for everyone. And it's the driving force in why patients have done better now than they did in the past. And what we hope is that the improvements that we've seen in the past will continue to translate in the future with ongoing clinical trials. And I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic that that will be the case. Now, there's different types of clinical research that's out there. So I thought it'd be just a good idea to highlight the different types of clinical research that's being done and give you a little bit of understanding of what these different concepts mean. So there are observational studies and there are clinical trials. Observational studies essentially observe patients in the real world. This can be done looking at a patient or a group of patients and seeing how they did in the past. So looking back in time, we call that retrospective observational studies or retrospective studies. Or we can look at a patient or group of patients and look to see how they're going to do in the future. We call that prospective or looking forward into time. Now, observational studies are real-world studies, so it's hard to control for all the different types of potential variables that might be out there. And because of that, observational studies are at a little higher risk for biases or finding the incorrect answer than other types of research that's done. And I'll contrast that with clinical trials. So clinical trials are research involving individuals, patients, and it's studying a specific, oftentimes studying a specific treatment and evaluating the effects of that treatment on health outcomes. So for instance, does one group of patients do better than another group of patients, looking at a specific type of outcome? These are designed to find ways to maybe prevent cancer from coming back, and the cancer severe, detect cancer early or treat cancer. They're designed to find ways to improve quality of life in patients, and most clinical trials now have a quality of life component that's built into them. They evaluate a specific intervention. There's really strict criteria of who can join a clinical trial. So unfortunately, not everybody is eligible for a clinical trial. It's looking forward into time or forward with time. So we call that prospective. So these are prospective clinical trials. And because there's a strict criteria of who can enter, because we're looking at a specific treatment outcome or looking at a specific drug, there's less risk for bias with clinical trial research compared to observational study research. Now, there are different types of clinical trials, and it's important to get a sense of the different types of clinical trials and what they're there to achieve. So I'm going to walk through each one of these different types of clinical trials. We have preclinical clinical trials, we have phase 1 clinical trials, we have phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 clinical trials. And I'll highlight the fact that most regulatory approval for new drugs comes after phase 3 clinical trials. Most of the clinical trials that we do at Cancer Care would fall within the phase 2 and phase 3 category. There is some phase 4 studies that we participate in as well. So the first type of study that is done is a preclinical study. This is where a company or a group of individuals or sponsors are looking at a novel idea or a novel drug that really hasn't been studied in a specific situation or setting. And these studies are not done in humans, they're done in the laboratory. They can be done in test tubes or on animals. And they're looking to see if there's activity with this novel idea or novel drug. And if there is some signal that's suggesting that there's benefit from it, then the group that's involved in these preclinical studies or research would put in an application for an investigational new drug. This investigational new drug application essentially outlines the study results. It gives information about the drug, for instance, who makes it, what's the preparation like, etc., and some details on what they're planning to do as for studying this novel idea moving forward. And they have to apply to the regulatory body within their country to get this investigational new drug application going. So in Canada, this would be the Health Canada regulatory body. And there's very strict criteria on, what kind of results are needed in order for a preclinical drug that's being studied to move into the human study population. And that's sort of highlighted a little bit with this slide. And that's just, again, to make the point that when drugs are being studied, there's very strict criteria. There's a high level of requirements for drugs to make their way through this process in order to make sure that it's as safe as possible for patients. And so one needs, in Canada, Health Canada approval. There also needs to be US Food and Drug Administration approval. There's research ethics boards that look at these studies to make sure that they're ethical. And then the sponsors that are sponsoring these clinical trials have to have a high level of regulatory, or meet a high level of regulatory oversight in order to be able to conduct these studies. So if a preclinical drug meets the criteria and gets this investigational drug application approved, then it can move into phase 1 studies. So phase 1 studies are the first type of study that involves humans. Usually these phase 1 studies don't just study one type of cancer at a time. They take a drug and they study it in a variety of different types of cancers. The first patient who is put on the study gets a low dose of the medication to make sure it's safe. And then over time, subsequent patients get higher doses of the medication. And the main point of a phase 1 study is to identify how safe it is. So they're looking to see what's the maximal tolerated dose for this medication, and make sure that they understand some of the safety related to this drug and that it's safe to move on to other studies. These phase 1 studies are usually small. They aren't open for necessarily all that long because they're pretty small. And again, they're mainly there to see if a medication is safe. If the medication is safe, it can move on to phase 2 clinical trials. Phase 2 clinical trials involve usually one type of cancer, not always, but usually. Most patients or most studies, everyone in the study will get the same dose of the treatment. So that's been determined by the phase 1 studies. And the endpoints of phase 2 studies are really to see, does the treatment have effectiveness for the type of cancer that's being studied? And there's different ways of defining effectiveness, but in phase 2 studies, usually the effectiveness is looked at to see, does the treatment shrink the tumor, or does the treatment delay the time for the cancer to come back? It's also looking, of course, to see what the side effects are and see if there are side effects that show up in phase 2 studies that didn't show up in the earlier phase 1 studies. Phase 2 studies are usually larger, involving more patients, typically in the range of between 25 and 100 patients. If a medication undergoes phase 2 study and is found to be beneficial, there's evidence that it's effective in trying to shrink the tumor or prevent the tumor from coming back and is safe, then it can move on to phase 3 clinical trials. And phase 3 clinical trial is really the best way for us to determine if a new treatment is better than the standard treatment. Sometimes there may not be a standard treatment, and if there is no standard treatment, then it would be compared to a placebo or fake treatment. Phase 3 clinical trials are randomized, meaning that patients don't have a say in which arm they're put into. It's a random process, a flip of the coin to see if patients get the new treatment or they get the standard treatment. Sometimes these phase 3 clinical trials are double-blinded, and what we mean by that is that patients and their providers don't actually know which treatment they're getting. It could be the new treatment or it could be the standard treatment, and it's blinded so that the patient or the healthcare provider doesn't actually know what the treatment is. I would say in the oncology world, double-blinded studies are not all that common, just because it can be challenging to make it so that that patients and their providers don't know. But it is something that is a standard way of doing phase 3 clinical trials. Phase 3 clinical.
Oh, Dr. Gingerich, can I just interrupt for a second? If you could just expand on that a bit more about double-blinded. I was just wondering how that worked in terms of like ethics around that, and does the ethical issues of people not knowing what if they're do they know that they're in a trial, but they just don't know what drug it is that they're taking? Is that what you meant?
Yeah. And Kathryn will probably expand a little bit on sort of what's required in order to enter into a clinical trial. But yes, patients will get understanding of exactly what the clinical trial is there to try to prove and what's required of them. The reason that double-blinded is sometimes done is because there is a less chance for bias if the patient and the providers don't know which treatment they're getting. So it's the best way of being objective, but it can't always be done. And in most cancer phase 3 clinical trials, if patients are randomized to the standard treatment or sometimes the placebo treatment, once there's evidence that that's not working, most of the time those patients are able to flip over and get the experimental treatment.
Okay, thanks.
Phase 3 studies are large. They aren't usually done at just one center. So these are multi-center studies and oftentimes multinational studies being taken or being done all over the world at the same time. The endpoints of phase 3 clinical trials are to really prove if a new treatment is better. And the gold standard to prove if a new treatment is better is to see if patients live longer. So looking at the overall survival of one group compared to another. But there are other ways that we also look to see if a drug is beneficial, and that is to see if patients are able to have their cancer controlled for longer, or have cancer shrink and prevent it from growing for a longer period of time, and also identifying if quality of life is the same or better than the standard treatment. These clinical trials typically involve hundreds of patients. And most of the time, for Health Canada to approve a new medication, it has to go through a phase 3 clinical trial. Now, this just gives you a bit of an overview of the regulatory requirements and how clinical trials directly contribute to new standard treatments for patients. So in a situation where a drug has gone through the different phases of clinical trial, and there's a phase 3 clinical trial that shows that it's beneficial, the manufacturer will submit information to Health Canada. Health Canada then will look at the information to see if it meets their criteria, and if it does and gets approved, then the drug will get a notice of compliance, sometimes called an NOC, and a drug identification number, or a DIN number. It will then go to the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health. This is sometimes called for short CADTH. And CADTH then is responsible for determining if this drug meets the criteria to be funded or be used in Canada. And so it will go to what's called a Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review Committee, or a PCODR committee, where the committee will look at the clinical evidence of how effective it is. They'll look at the cost effectiveness. They'll take into consideration patient perspectives on the need for the medication. And with all that information, they will decide if the medication should be approved. If it is approved from PCODR and the CADTH committees, then it will go to the different provinces, and the provinces usually work together to determine the funding for it, and if they come to a conclusion on the funding, and usually for drugs that are approved through CADTH and PCODR, they will eventually come to a conclusion on the funding. Then they will negotiate a final price and pick a starting date to allow patients off of clinical trials to get this. Most provinces, or all provinces, would use the same criteria. So the final funding is usually uniform across the country, but the dates when a drug is available can sometimes change. And you can see that if you look at the time process for this pathway, this can be in the range of a year or two, or sometimes longer.
Dr. Gingerich, there was a couple of financial questions around that. Does that mean that the clinical trial drugs are covered by pharmacare?
So that's a really good, important question. So there's sort of two processes here. One is the clinical trial part of it. The second is the actual funding to be used off of a clinical trial as a new standard of care. So in patients that are participating in a clinical trial, the medications as part of those clinical trial are covered usually by the clinical trial sponsors. And so there is not a cost for patients to be participating in them. Once the clinical trial results are available and it has gone to this PCODR committee and been approved and goes to the province, then it's up for the province to decide when they will start funding it for all patients off of a clinical trial. All right, so if we look at phase 4 clinical trials, this is really to evaluate drugs that have already been approved. The endpoints of phase 4 clinical trials are to look for rare side effects that may have not shown up in previous clinical trials, to evaluate quality of life and cost effectiveness. And usually these studies involve thousands of patients. And something that some patients may be aware of is something called a special access program. And special access programs are a type of phase 4 clinical trial, and it essentially allows providers and patients to get access to these medications as part of a phase 4 study before it's made its way through the entire regulatory pathway and been approved by the provinces for general use. Now, my last slide is to talk a little bit about how long does it take for a drug to make it to market. And this is just a snapshot, and it's not necessarily like this for every study, but for every drug, but it's not uncommon for this process to take a number of years, and it can take up to 12 years, depending on the situation or the medication. And it is a fairly expensive process. It can cost in the range of $1 billion to go through the whole pathway of getting a drug from idea to final approval. And, drug companies or sponsors that are involved in looking at drugs through this process are really looking to find drugs that can reach the market as quickly as possible. They're looking for new indications. There means that there's a little bit less pricing pressure once it meets the market. And they're looking to try and, get a good return on their investment. So that doesn't necessarily mean that all good ideas, a good idea may not necessarily make its way to a clinical trial because of some of these underlying issues. And this is sort of the reality of where we're at. So with that, I think I'm going to stop and pass it over to Kathryn.
Sure. And maybe either one of you might be able to answer these questions, but just with respect to the funding for this huge amount of money that goes into this, there's a big market for complementary therapies, but my question is, like, if something can't be patented, how does it even get to a clinical trial? Do things that pharmaceutical companies may not be interested in because they can't be patented by them, do they go to clinical trials? Is there money for research into those things?
Kathryn, do you want me to answer that, or do you want to answer that?
Sure, if you want to take that one, I'll get my screen set up.
Okay, sure. So that is an issue. That means that not all good ideas necessarily go through the clinical trial pathway. That being said, there's sort of two general pathways that one can take a medication through the clinical trial journey. One is through pharmaceutical companies, and they're looking for the return on investment, et cetera. But there's another pathway, and that's looking from a more academic standpoint. And academic clinical trials oftentimes ask questions that are not quite as financially reimbursable. And so there's another group of studies that we would participate in, and these are academic studies. One group of that's called the CCTG group, which is a Canadian group that's looking specifically at questions that are important for cancer and moving the field of oncology forward, but may not necessarily fit within kind of trying to reap the most financial rewards. So there are different pathways to answer some of those different kinds of questions.
Thank you.
All right, so over to me. I'm going to start off with the benefits of clinical trials. So there's many benefits to clinical trials. A clinical trial could offer more treatment options than you had previously. You may be the one that you would be able to receive a promising new treatment that maybe is not widely available to the general population yet. The clinical trial team will closely monitor you and follow you throughout your cancer care journey. And that's not to say that if you don't go on a clinical trial, you won't be followed closely, but often is the case when you participate in a clinical trial, you often have to come in more frequently, just because oftentimes you may be receiving a drug that we don't know 100% of how it will react or how you will react to it. So we want to make sure that we're really closely keeping an eye on you. So that often means coming in a bit more frequently than you would if you were receiving standard treatment. You will also add to the knowledge for your type of cancer. So even if the trial is not successful and that drug does not go on to market and be widely available, you are adding to the general knowledge base. And future cancer patients may benefit from the findings. So in terms of what type of patients are in a clinical trial, so question about why. So here's some of the reasons we hear from people of why they enroll in a clinical trial. For some patients, it's a matter of bringing hope. Altruism factors in, so kind of a feeling of satisfaction, knowing that they may be helping others. So if not for themselves, helping others both now and possibly in the future. For some, it's a discussion they've had with family members or family physician who maybe feel strongly that this would be in the patient's best interest. There could also be maybe a lack of other options available to the patient, depending on what disease they have and at what point they are in their care. And for some patients, it's a feeling for them to gain control over their disease. So type of patients that we typically see enroll in a trial, typically we see patients of a younger age, Caucasian patients, and those with a higher education. So the question here is why this demographic? So we know that results of trials really need to be generalizable to the patient population. And unfortunately, the people who typically enroll in a trial are often not indicative of the general population. So work definitely needs to be done to address this gap. And we really need to focus on what's called EDI. So that's equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially so in clinical trial participation. So that really starts with education and webinars like this one to really try to provide information about clinical trials to a wider range of people. All right, so the clinical trials unit here at Cancer Care, this is one of the many different departments that exist within Cancer Care. The goal of the unit is to provide tomorrow's treatment today to every eligible patient with cancer or blood disorder in Manitoba. So how does it work? The clinical trials unit is directed by the various disease site groups. So we call them DSGs. These DSGs are a multidisciplinary team of experts who treat a specific type of cancer. So there'll be a breast DSG, a lung DSG, a gastrointestinal DSG, etc. So they evaluate, amongst many other things that those groups do, one of their tasks is to evaluate trials that are felt to be of most potential benefit to the people of Manitoba. So they're looking at our patient population, they're looking at incident cases, they're looking at the eligibility criteria specific to the trial, and trying to determine the number of patients that the trial could potentially benefit. So we run trials here that are both for newly diagnosed patients as well as trials for patients whose disease may have spread for metastatic disease. The DSGs are typically looking ahead to see what trials are close to closing, and that means that they would not be able to accept any new enrollments, but we would continue to follow the patients who are existing and who have already enrolled in the trial. So ideally, they're looking ahead to see if there's a replacement trial for that trial and have it ready to go for when that trial closes. They want to try and have something for the most common type of cancers. So once the disease site groups have determined that this is a trial they feel would be of benefit, they bring it forward to the clinical trials unit. So the clinical trials unit in itself is not the group that is deciding what trials are brought forward. This team does do their own feasibility review just to make sure that the resources, that we can meet the requirements of the trial and that we have the resources to conduct the trial. So the team consists of about a little over 40 people. So these are people with expertise in the areas of ethics and regulatory affairs, data collection, research nurses, and a leadership team. So clinical trials require a very high standard and meticulous documentation. That's part of what this team does. I just wanted to give you a sense for the numbers and kind of the activity level at Cancer Care for clinical trials. So these numbers are based on a 5-year average of data between 2018 and 2022, and they take into account both adult and pediatric patients. So for example, the number of new trials that we would open each year for participation, on average about 23 new trials. At any given time throughout the year, we have about 92 trials active, meaning you could actively participate, assuming you meet the eligibility criteria. So that seems like a lot. That's because trials are opening and closing at all different times throughout the year. New patients enrolled in a trial, we typically have an average of 236 new patients a year enroll. And overall, at any given time, we're following just over 1,700 patients. And that's because trials have usually an active treatment phase and a follow-up phase, and you kind of transition through. And once you hit the follow-up phase, it could be monthly visits, then transition to quarterly, and eventually you'll probably be coming in for annual checkups. So these patients are some are on active treatment, some might be closer to the end of the stage in the follow-up phase, But oftentimes for trials, patients are followed for their entire life. So it's really important to still continue to submit their data on how they're doing. So over the last 10 years, we've about 2,500 patients have participated in a clinical trial. And this is fairly similar in terms of activity to other cancer centers of a similar size across Canada.
Kathryn, just a question about that in terms of other provinces. So do people have the opportunity to participate in clinical trials that might be occurring in another province? And if so, are there costs covered for them to travel to receive treatment in other provinces if they are eligible for a clinical trial there?
Yeah, good question. That's one we often run into. So obviously, Cancer Care only has access to, or only has open a select number of trials. So due to resources and our ability, we won't be able to have a trial available or every single trial open at Cancer Care that exists. So as I mentioned, each DSG selects the trials that they feel will be most benefit to the people of Manitoba, given the resources that we have available. So if you're eligible to participate in a trial that's available at another center or another province, typically that's a discussion between your oncologist, and sometimes the Cancer Care patient rep as well gets involved to kind of look at the logistics. And in most situations, the cost of the travel to another center and the accommodations would be at the patient's expense. Usually we're not able to get government funding to support someone to move or to go into a trial at another province, because it's considered experimental and there's no guarantee that this treatment will be beneficial. So the experience that we've had with that, when patients are looking at all the trials available across Canada and maybe see one that is not open here in Manitoba but is in another province, that typically would be kind of the process, so the discussion with the oncologist of what is possible and what sort of expenses the patient might have to incur if that's the route that they choose to go.
And so typically your team would come to you and let you know about a trial, or do patients often make inquiries about what trials are available for me?
Yeah, it's usually the latter. So they would typically patients would come to their oncologist and say, I was looking online and I came across this trial. It looks like it's a good trial for me. I don't know for sure. The oncologist can look a little bit further into those specific eligibility criteria. And it may very well be that, you've seen on the surface that you think you might qualify, but perhaps when you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the actual eligibility criteria, you may not qualify. But if you do, yeah, usually it would be the patient. We've seen most often the patient bringing that to their oncologist to inquire.
So if there are trials that are available at Cancer Care Manitoba, would it be typical for the oncologist to then approach the patient and ask them if they are interested, or is it the patient that's also initiating the inquiry?
Yeah, we've actually seen it both ways. So one of the first things, the discussion when you're coming to Cancer Care for your first visit is to review your treatment options. So the oncologist will go through what's available, and they will kind of go through what the standard treatment is available to you. And if there's a clinical trial, then the oncologist will also offer that as one of your treatment options. We've also seen it, though, the other way, that patients come to their first visit fully prepared with having, researched and know what's out there for clinical trials. And they are very, that's great as well when they say, hey, I know a little bit about clinical trials. Can you tell me if this particular trial is open here, or tell me about the trials that are available possibly for my participation here at Cancer Care?
Thank you.
All right, so my last slide is just in terms of where you can get more information about trials at Cancer Care. The very best way is always to ask your physician. They are the ones who know and know exactly what trials are open at Cancer Care and will know which ones you could possibly participate in. There's also quite a bit of good information on the website. So the Clinical Trials Unit website, or the Cancer Care website, under clinical trials, there's some good general information about trials. You can also contact the clinical trials unit directly with the phone number as listed here, and they can direct you to the right person depending on your questions. One of the things that we're working on is our website is under development, but right now, if you go to that website, you will not yet be able to search the list of available trials that are open at Cancer Care. So that's something we're looking to improve on with the website refresh, is to have available a link that patients can click on so that they can search by cancer type and easily see what trials are available for their type of cancer. And I've listed just 3 other websites that are helpful for some general information about clinical trials. That clinicaltrials.gov listing or website is actually an international clinical trial listing. So that would list trials that are available all over the world.
Thank you,
Well,
Kathryn.
thank you. Yeah.
So we have a few minutes for some questions. I do have a couple of questions that the attendees have asked. So one of them was actually relating to a slide that Dr. Gingerich had showed earlier about overall survival rates for 5 years. The patient asked, do they take into consideration the average age of those diagnosed with cancer when they look at survival rates? Because in this case, they've been diagnosed with esophageal cancer, and they're only 36 years old. And this person has read that the average age of someone that's diagnosed with this cancer is between 70 and 80 years old. So do they take into that when they look at those survival rates?
Yeah, so the information that I presented was the more generalized information for a variety of different types of cancers, and essentially just showing that over time there's been an improvement in outcome across the board. Now, each individual cancer will have its own sort of specific information around that of how things have changed with time. And so I probably shouldn't talk specifics around the esophageal cancer part of things, but in general, there's been an improvement, and our hope is that there will continue to be a significant improvement. And I should just mention that, you know, if there's thousands of clinical trials that are going on all the time around the world. And so it's impossible for, you know, us to be involved in every study, but the amount of studies that we have is always changing as you know, new studies come in and old studies close. But the bottom line is there's just a real reason to be optimistic that with all this research that's been going on around the world, that outcomes are going to continue to get better, and the treatment you know, breakthroughs are happening regularly. Now, sometimes we wish they were bigger breakthroughs, and there's hope that there will be in the future. But I think it's a really there's a lot of hope for patients as they journey through their cancer in 2024.
Yeah, this is it is very promising and optimistic, this discussion. So, but I do have a question that might be on the minds of other people as well, and I have to ask it. COVID had showed how when there was a global effort, vaccines, for in this case, could come to market much more quickly than 12 years is kind of what you were saying for these drugs. So what has to happen for people to work collectively to make these drugs available more quickly? I guess that's what I'm wondering.
I think that's a really insightful question and an important one. And you're right, the process to go through all these different steps can take a long time. And ideally, it would be nice if it could take a significant less amount of time. And we did see during the pandemic that there appeared to be, you know, this very quick change in treatment options for patients with COVID, and specifically the vaccines. And so why can't that be done for cancer patients? And I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is that cancer is a very complicated, complex process, more so than the COVID virus. And so each cancer, different types of cancers, you know, have different underlying drivers that are driving that cancer. And so it's not a one size fits all process. So it's more complicated. The second part is that we're dealing with treatment options that can be very toxic. And so we have to make sure we do our due diligence to make sure that the treatments that we're giving patients are, number one, beneficial, but also number two, not too toxic and are safe for patients. So that's another component of things. Now, there are some new ways of looking at studying drugs that came about, or I should say got sped up with the COVID vaccines. And one of them is looking at something called platform trials, which is a sort of a newer way of thinking about clinical trial research, where instead of having one study that looks at one drug, and once that drug is been studied, the study closes, it's looking at having active arms, different types of drugs being studied at the same time, and over time sort of changing which drugs are being studied. So it's one study that's kind of continues on over time and can look at a variety of different types of outcomes. And so that's something that's, I think, may help speed up the process for oncology drugs and the approval process. But there has to be a lot of oversight and strict criteria related to that. And then the other thing that I think can potentially speed up the process is maybe artificial intelligence, ability to look at a lot of different types of molecular architecture in a tumor and come up with designer type drugs that might be able to target that on a more quick or fast process than the traditional way of doing it. So that sort of is a bit of a longer answer.
No, that's great. No, thank you. Question about prioritization of clinical trials, either between different cancers or within certain cancers. Is that the committee that you spoke about, or the team that you spoke about, Kathryn, that would make those decisions?
Yeah, I thought I'll share my screen because I can show you a slide that I have here that can probably easier to see it. Okay. This one. Okay. So question about the prioritization of trials. So trials, the clinical trials unit is structured by tumor groups. So we have 4 different tumor groups. So so this is our hematology group, our solid tumor group 1, solid tumor group 2, and our pediatric group. So within each team, you'll see that there's various disease sites within each team. So trials are prioritized within each group, and that's done with the assistance of the physician lead within each group and in consultation with the disease site group lead or chair of each of these diseases. So factors to consider when prioritizing what trials will be next to be assigned for study activation. So some of the things include, like, when is the study anticipated to close? If it's going to be closing in a couple of months, and we know it takes us, roughly 8 to 10 months to get a trial open, it's likely not one that we'd be able to get open in time for patients to actually be able to benefit and enroll. The potential benefits of the study is looked at. How many people could potentially benefit at cancer care? Those are some of the questions that they look at when they tackle prioritizing trials, because each of these disease site groups is bringing forward potential trials that they would like to run within their teams. So it's the job of this physician lead of that group to work with the DSG chairs and kind of come up together collaboratively as a group to prioritize the trials within these teams. And each of these groups has someone dedicated within the clinical trials unit to activate studies. So each of them has an individual who then takes the direction from the group and then knows which one to work on next to start working on the trial.
Thank you, Kathryn. So there's a few more questions that we'll try to get to. Somebody had a question if they can qualify for a clinical trial if they're over the age of 80.
Yeah, so Kathryn, do you want me to answer that? Okay.
Yeah.
So most clinical trials do not have a specific age limit to them. There are other factors that are usually looked at. So the type of cancer, sometimes clinical trials are looking at a specific subset of patient with a specific cancer. So for instance, looking to see if there's a specific molecular abnormality within the tumor that would allow a patient to be eligible for a particular clinical trial. Looking at things like performance status, which is to say, how healthy an individual is and how many symptoms or how much symptom is or how much they're being affected by the tumor or their condition. And so most clinical trials want patients that are relatively healthy and also not having too many symptoms related to their cancer. So those would be some of the issues that might prevent a patient from being on a clinical trial if they're potentially eligible, rather than age.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question was, are clinical trials available to people living in northern Manitoba?
Kathryn, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, that one, so you can jump in, but my initial thought is that's one of the unfortunate things about clinical trial regulations. And I mean, it's a good thing that clinical trials are so highly regulated, and we would want them to be, because we are testing something we don't know 100% will work and how it will affect people. But at the same time, it really limits us by geography. So because there's so many rules around who can give the drug and how the drug can be transported and the specialized training you need to be involved in clinical trials, it has to be given by a certain set of people who have done the special training, who are signed up to work specifically with the trial and have reviewed the trial in detail. So right now, trials are centralized here at Cancer Care at our 675 McDermott site for that reason. But there is a large movement underway, a pan-Canadian initiative to try to what they call as decentralized clinical trials. So to allow at least some of the activities of the trial to be done outside of the main center. So to be done at centers, rural centers across Canada or in the northern regions, that people, well, you may not be able to get your experimental drug given to you out there. Maybe you could at least have your blood work or your assessment. If, the staff there could be trained minimally on trials and know the basics, and then any significant issues, they would have to come and, the treatment to be given here at the main site. So Health Canada is really trying to work with sites who are saying we're really limiting the number of people who can participate by geography when you say that it can only be done at a certain area, but at the same time, we know the reasons why. It's for patient safety, and we want to make sure the patients are being treated safely by the appropriate people who have the right education. So right now, the answer is, unfortunately, they would have to have the ability to come to Winnipeg for those treatments, but we are really looking at trying to, and not just us across Canada, find ways for them not to have to make so many visits into the city. So even if a few things, as I said, could be done closer to home, I think it would really allow more patients to be able to benefit from participating in a trial.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Question about cures in terms of people being cured from clinical trials, but I suppose that would be the evidence that you had suggested, Dr. Gingerich, about survival rates. I mean, when we talk about cures, I think you're talking about 5-year survival rates.
Yes. Yeah. Again, that was for a general population. There is some, you can look, each clinical trial, of course, is looking at a specific drug in a specific situation. And so that clinical trial may show that there's benefit. It may also show that the new experimental treatment doesn't have benefit. And that's why the trial is being done, to prove or disprove if treatment is beneficial. So, being part of a clinical trial, I think, has a number of benefits. One is it provides patients hope. Another is that it is helping to move the field of oncology forward. And part of that is that, the benefit may be there for the patient who participates in the clinical trial. But on the other hand, it for sure will help future patients so that we have a better understanding of how we should treat future patients in the future. So there's different reasons that patients participate in clinical trials, and those are just a couple of them.
Thank you. Are there trials for somebody that's completed treatment? In this case, the person's asked that they finished treatment for prostate cancer a year ago. Would there be types of clinical trials that would be designed to follow a person post-treatment to look at their PSA levels or something like that? Or
Yeah, so clinical trials and the clinical research that's being done at cancer care and other places, again, is constantly changing. And so I would say that the best way to answer that is they should talk with their healthcare provider, their oncologist, to see if there might be a clinical trial that they would fit into.
Other financial questions again. Does cancer care cover travel from the north for somebody to participate in a clinical trial?
Kathryn, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. So for specific trials, so depending on what trial you're involved in, sometimes the trial sponsor, so that's the group coordinating the trial, will be able to offer some funding support for things like that, travel or parking or meals. And unfortunately, it's not across the board. So some of those studies that are not sponsored by a pharmaceutical company or a drug company don't have the ability to fund patient reimbursements for that sort of thing because they're receiving grants from other agencies and they just don't have the ability, like perhaps the drug companies do, to be able to support patients in that way. And it is very unfortunate. But for the ones that are participating in trials that do offer that reimbursement, I think it's very helpful for patients to be able to have that option.
And it's a related question. Somebody asked what would be an average time that someone might have to be in Winnipeg to participate in a clinical trial, but I suppose that would be depending on the nature of the trial itself. That would vary quite a bit.
Yeah, I would say.
Also a question about money again. I mean, these are big dollars that are being spent on clinical trials. I guess the cost, like you said, almost $1 billion on average, but does cancer care save money by having clinical trials? And is the money that is saved reinvested into research?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to look at this, I guess. So the way that clinical trials are set up at most institutions is that the clinical trial unit does get some money from the sponsor of the clinical trial for patients that are put on the clinical trial. That money helps to support the cost that is required to meet the high stringent requirements to participate in clinical trial. It doesn't cover all of it, but in general, it doesn't cover all of it. But it does help make help to defer some of the costs. So there is some benefit to the system that way. There's also benefit to the system in terms of having the medications that are part of the clinical trial being paid by the clinical trial sponsors. And so that does save the overall, in our case, province of Manitoba money, because that cost of those medications would otherwise have to be paid for through general accounts rather than through the clinical trial program. So there's a couple of different benefits from it that way. It also helps to spur on economic development within, in our case, the province, with the jobs that are created for meeting those high quality stringent criteria.
And in terms of those savings that we, that the government, their drug budget saves when the drug company can provide some of those standard of care drugs free of cost to us, unfortunately, there is no reinvestment. So it's not like we get that money back to show the savings. Even though we do demonstrate to the government there is savings through clinical trial participation, we haven't been successful in getting that money directly put back into clinical trials to be able to do more trials. But we do definitely present that information about the amount that is saved when sponsors are able to provide those drugs as part of the trial.
Thank you. This is a more specific question, and I'm not sure whether you can answer that this question, but are there currently any trials for neuroendocrine tumor syndrome?
Yeah, I think it would be best for to specifically answer that question to have the person talk with their healthcare provider about it, just because each situation is a little bit unique and different. So I would just encourage them to talk with their healthcare provider.
Okay, thank you. Kathryn, would you be able to share the website again with the information on clinical trials where people can find more information?
Sure.
The one with the phone numbers?
Yeah.
And we have one last question. Is there a cap on trials due to limited resources?
So that's a great question. The way that it's sort of set up in most cancer centers, including ours, is that we're trying to find a balance in terms of trying to find the maximum amount of patients that can benefit from clinical trials, but also making sure that the type of clinical trials that are selected can be, sustainable long-term for Cancer Care Manitoba, and make sure that we can continue to provide, clinical trials for patients in the future. And so there's some clinical trials that bring in some more resources than others. And so we're trying to find this balance between the two to make sure that we have a robust system of clinical trials that are available for patients that's also, sustainable over the long term. And there's a lot of work that goes in the background to make clinical trials function. And so there is, human resource limitations on exactly, how many trials that we can have open at one time. That being said, what we're hoping is to try to improve our portfolio and have more trials available to patients as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's really exciting to see those numbers about how many people are participating in clinical trials. And I just want to thank you both so much for being here today and helping us understand so much more about the role of clinical trials and the possibilities that they hold for us. So thank you both again, and thank you to our viewers for joining us. And if you could take a minute to complete our survey, we really value your feedback in planning future webinars. And we invite you to join us again in February. We will be having a webinar about the basics of surgery in oncology and cancer treatment. So hoping to connect with you again. Thank you again. Take care for now, everyone.
Thank you.